The first question was from Tom in Detroit. And Tom asked, were the Kamenev-Zinoviev confessions at the Moscow trials legit? Well, I will give an answer to that. The thing is, Anthony's in Fort Worth, Texas. Shout out to you. The thing is, okay, so first of all, let's give the proper context. What were the Moscow trials? So in the Soviet Union, there was a government official, Sergei Kirov, who was assassinated. He was shot, and he was a Communist Party official. He was an ally of Stalin. And I believe it was in like 1934, 1935, Sergei Kirov was assassinated. And the secret police in the Soviet Union began investigating the assassination of Sergei Kirov. And they came to the conclusion that Sergei Kirov was killed as part of a wider conspiracy. And they began uncovering kind of a network of people within the Soviet Communist Party who wanted to bring Trotsky back to power, and who wanted to, and were collaborating with the Nazis in order to do it. And that resulted in the famous Moscow trials of 1937, where Zinoviev and Kamenev confessed to having been part of this conspiracy with Trotsky and with support from Japan and from the Nazis to bring down Stalin and put Trotsky in charge of the Soviet Union. Now, Trotsky insisted he was innocent of this, and the mainstream media at the time said this is just a Stalinist frame-up. And generally the way it's presented, right, is that this was just Stalin going after his political rivals. This was just a political hatchet job. These were Stalinist show trials, etc. I don't know what to believe about it. I'll just be honest with you. I don't know what to believe. And I think that people who, we know that in 1937, they had what was called Yezhovshchina, the Great Terror. And all kinds of innocent people got arrested, got accused of being Nazi spies when they weren't. And all kinds of people who didn't belong in Gulag prisons were sent to them. And that eventually Stalin executed the head of the secret police, Yezhov, for his abuses of power, for persecuting innocent people, for doing what he did. So we know that a lot of things that should not have gone on during 1937 happened. And a lot of innocent people were accused. There's no question about that. But what went on during the Great Terror was wrong. And that even Stalin's biggest defenders say that what happened during those years was wrong. So there is absolutely no reason to act like Stalin did nothing wrong. There's no reason to act like everything was fine and dandy. We can all agree that 1937, the year of the Great Terror, was a nightmare for Soviet society, and that a lot of innocent people got hurt. And that's why, first of all, I don't like Gulag jokes. I don't. Because imagine if one of your family members was a good, loyal Communist Party person who got rounded up and thrown in one of those gulags. You wouldn't think those jokes were funny, now would you? And that we shouldn't make light of that. That is a stain. That moment, Yezhovshchina, is a stain on the history of our movement. And, a lot of innocent people got hurt. Okay, now why did they get hurt? Yezhov eventually got executed. Was Stalin the good guy who was trying to stop it? And, there's different interpretations. But we can all agree that those were bad years and a lot of innocent people got hurt. We can all agree on that. But the specific question was, were the confessions from Zinoviev and Kamenev legitimate? And my answer is, I do not know. They could have been forced, right? And that's the standard interpretation, is that they were tortured, that the secret police and Yezhov tortured them. There was threats against their families or whatever, and so they had to get up and give this confession in order to avoid further torture or further retaliation. And this was just a pack of lies to justify what the secret police was doing. That's the standard interpretation. And it could be true. We know that Yezhov was a bad guy. We know there were some bad actors in the secret police and the GPU of the Soviet Union at the time. So it's possible. It's possible. It's very possible. However, It's also possible they were telling the truth. And to think that that there's no possibility that a high ranking Soviet official could have possibly been plotting to kill Stalin, could have possibly been working with Trotsky. No, you have to admit there was the fact that after Stalin died, Khrushchev came in there and took a dump all over Stalin and basically pandered to the United States by saying that everything that was said about Stalin in US media was true, and that Khrushchev, on top of that, lied in his speech, said things that were ridiculous, that everyone knew were falsehoods, just in the hopes of pandering. That shows that under the surface, there was a, I don't know what you want to call it, a weak or counter-revolutionary current within the Soviet Party, a revisionist current within the Soviet Party that didn't really want to fight the imperialists. That existed. It completely existed. Also, there had been very big divisions in the Soviet Communist Party, and Stalin's triumph over Trotsky, and Trotsky fleeing the country and becoming a professional anti-Soviet agitator, that was very real. And that Trotsky did communicate with Bukharin and Zinoviev. We know that. There are mail receipts that were found, in the Trotsky archives. Trotsky said he never communicated with them, but there are mail receipts. We know Trotsky was in communication. In Germany, when they were in Germany, he was sending them letters in Berlin or something. We don't know what was said in those letters. There was some communication between Trotsky and Zinoviev and Bukharin and Kamenev. There was some communication. We don't know what was said. So it's possible that they could have been telling the truth. It's also possible that they were acting under duress. What is interesting and what nobody points out is that the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union from the United States, from U.S. imperialism, Joseph Davies, was in the courtroom for those trials. And he was a trial lawyer in America. He had been a trial lawyer before he became the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union. And he was convinced that Zinoviev and Kamenev were guilty. So, think about that for a moment, right? If an American trial lawyer who spent years in the American political system, if he's sitting in the courtroom and listening to the confessions and he believes it, that indicates, that might be the case. And there were some others. There were some other prominent intellectuals. I believe there were some prominent British politicians who believed they were guilty. I think Upton Sinclair, if I'm not mistaken, and Sidney and Beatrice Webb, and H.G. Wells, and there were a number of non-communist Western intellectuals who sat in the courtroom and believed they were guilty. Now, could they have been fooled? Of course, right? Russian was not their first language. And, and you put on a good show, you coach people in the right way. So we don't know. I will point you toward, Stalin wrote a pamphlet called Mastering Bolshevism. And in his pamphlet, Mastering Bolshevism, he makes this point, which I think is very persuasive. Stalin says that the imperialists, the French imperialists, the American imperialists, the British imperialists, they spend millions of dollars spying on each other. They have whole intelligence agencies. There are French spies in America. There are American spies in France. There are British spies in France. There are French spies in Britain. All of the imperialist governments are constantly spying on each other, are constantly conspiring against each other, are constantly, maneuvering and manipulating each other's political systems. So it's very, very naive to think that they wouldn't team up to try and manipulate the Soviet political system. And to think that there weren't a huge amount of spies from America, a huge amount of spies from Britain, a huge amount of spies from France and Germany in the Soviet Union is extremely naive. And to think that when the Soviet socialism was about overthrowing imperialism, it was against all of those Western imperialists, to think that they wouldn't combine their efforts to conspire within the Soviet Union to bring down Stalin, that they wouldn't bring Trotsky into their conspiracy if they could, is extremely naive. It's very possible. It's very possible that yes, Zinoviev and Kamenev were guilty of working with the Western imperialists and with Trotsky to try and overthrow Stalin. It's very possible. Not saying it happened though, because I don't know and I'm not convinced. Trotsky sending letters, that's not proof of anything, right? That's just proof that Trotsky sent somebody a letter. We don't know, right? And their confessions, people have criticized it. There's like a hotel and it's not the right name of the hotel, and we don't know. And we know that the secret police in Russia was doing a lot of evil things during that time. Now, that's true, right? That the Yezhov, the secret police under Stalin, did a lot of very bad things, and a lot of people were hurt. And eventually, Yezhov, the head of the secret police, got the death penalty for all the evil things he did to people during that time period. So I don't know. And it's interesting. I'm giving you, Tom, and I don't know, but I'm urging people to change the way they think about the period, because the standard understanding that people have of that period is that evil Stalin was just maneuvering to get rid of all of his political rivals. And that is such a naive way of understanding. That's such a naive way of understanding that time period, right? Again, why wouldn't there be a huge network of US spies in the Soviet Union? Why wouldn't there be a whole network of German spies in the Soviet Union? Why wouldn't they try to recruit Trotsky, a former Soviet official who had a falling out with Stalin, to be part of their spy? There's nothing incredible about it. Is it thoroughly proven? Do we have 100% proof that it happened? No. But is it possible? Yeah, it's very possible that. Look, how many coups has the U.S. government pulled off? They've overthrew the government of Chile in 1973. They overthrew the government of Argentina in the 80s. All over the world, they conspire and they pull off coups and they overthrow governments and they engage in covert operations. So why in the world would you think that the late 30s in the Soviet Union, nothing happened? Yeah, you can be sure that in the lead up to World War II, when the Soviet Union was riding high, was the leader of the global communist movement, and World War II was on the horizon, you can be absolutely sure that American intelligence and British intelligence and French intelligence and German intelligence and Japanese intelligence and Italian intelligence, they were all over the Soviet Union doing all kinds of shit. You can be sure of that. And the Soviet security services had a big job on their hands of trying to keep the U.S. imperialists and the British imperialists and the French imperialists and the German imperialists from pulling off some kind of military coup and overthrowing socialism in the Soviet Union, right? And to think that some kind of conspiracy couldn't penetrate the high levels of the Soviet Communist Party, that is so naive. It's so naive, right? It's possible. It's a very conceivable story, but I don't see solid proof. And I also know that a lot of bad things happened. And one thing I will say is, please stop it with the Gulag jokes. Please, I'm begging you, stop it with the Gulag jokes. Stop it with the Stalin did nothing wrong. All right? Trust me. Bad shit happened in those times. Good, dedicated communists got persecuted and punished. And there's no, and if you make light of all of that, if you pretend that none of that stuff ever happened, eventually you're going to get to a moment where you realize that shit happened and you're going to turn against communism. Right? Remember the God that failed, right? If you think the Soviet Union was infallible and they didn't do anything wrong and they didn't have problems, eventually you're going to have this moment where you realize they fucked up badly. And then you're going to turn against all of it, right? And that's the problem. Don't have a light switch mentality. Do not have a light switch mentality. Don't fall into the trap of blindly defending and refusing to admit the flaws that existed there. Because you're going to face a world of hurt, right? You're going to face a world of hurt if you get into that mindset. I'm telling you, right? If you think Cuba is heaven on earth, when you go to Cuba and you see the hardship that they endure, and you see various things that Cuba has problems with, you're going to turn against communism. But if you can be honest and say Cuba has had great achievements, but they also have some shortcomings, you can stay loyal to the project. And it's really, really, really important, really, really important not to fall into the mindset where we don't admit there were problems. There were problems during those years. A lot of innocent people got hurt. The gulags were a nightmare. The Great Terror was a nightmare. What the secret police were doing during the Great Terror, Yezhovshchina, was a nightmare. I'm repeating myself, but it's important. So we must view this with nuance. And at the end of the day, were Kamenev and Zinoviev actually guilty? I don't know. I don't know. They could have been. And if someone tries to tell you, let me repeat, if someone tries to tell you that there's no possible way that high-ranking members of the Soviet Communist Party could have been plotting against the Soviet Union, if someone tells you that, ask them what happened in 1991. The fall of the Soviet Union was high-ranking members of the Soviet Communist Party working against the Soviet Union. Ask them what happened in 1956 with Khrushchev's secret speech. That was the highest-ranking member of the Soviet government working against the interests of the Soviet Union. If you think that the idea that a very high-ranking Soviet leader couldn't possibly have been recruited by the West, couldn't possibly have been trying to undermine the Soviet Union from within, you're very, very, very naive. So that's why I can't give you a real answer. That's why I can't give you a real answer, because I don't know. And my defense of the Soviet Union is not based on Stalin being, so great and infallible, because he wasn't. Stalin made a lot of mistakes. Stalin did the best he could under those circumstances. Stalin, was given a task that it would be like, you can't imagine the amount of responsibility that fell on that man's shoulders during World War II, during the industrialization. You can't imagine any of that. That said, there are things that I'm sure Stalin would have done differently if he did it again. Stalin had problems, and what happened after Stalin's death, the fact that Khrushchev was able to get in there and throw him under the bus the way he did, the fact that in the 60s and 70s, the Soviet Union started coming apart, all of this points to the fact that there were things Stalin clearly did wrong. Clearly. The reason I defend the Soviet Union is not based on Stalin's personality or thinking Stalin was infallible. That's not it. I defend the Soviet Union because they defeated the Nazis, because they invented space travel, because they lifted millions of people out of poverty, because they wiped out illiteracy, because they turned an agrarian country into an industrial country very rapidly, because they supported the Black freedom struggle in America, because they supported the labor movement in America and got us the 8-hour workday and the minimum wage and Social Security, because they built a global anti-fascist movement that saved humanity from the Nazis, because they empowered women, because they advanced science and they invented LED lights. And I praise the Soviet Union for building infrastructure in Libya and building infrastructure in Egypt and raising people all over the world out of poverty and helping start China on the course of building. The achievements of the Soviet Union are massive, massive. What was achieved during the Soviet years is so huge and so utterly amazing. When a whole country becomes a superpower overnight, when a country is leading a global movement that pushes racial equality and fights for the rights of the working class and defeats the Nazis and advances the science. The huge levels of achievement that the Soviet Union had cannot be underestimated. That is what I defend. I don't have to defend the other stuff. I don't have to defend the political repression. There's no reason. There is absolutely no reason that I can't acknowledge the good and criticize the bad. There's no reason I can't do that. There is absolutely no reason I can't do that. I can say that the persecution of Christians, the suppression of the church in the Soviet Union was wrong. And as a Christian, I can say that big mistakes were made in how they dealt with Christians. I can say that. I can say that, the Soviet Union had an issue with consumer goods. They were very good at heavy industry. They were not good at consumer technology. I can say that, and that there can be a nuanced approach to these things.